Hello everyone, welcome to another series of Mind Map. Today's topic of discussion is constitutional developments during British Raj. First of all, we will have a look at the introduction of the topic, then we will discuss about constitutional development during Company's rule, constitutional development under Crown rule, timeline, and lastly practice question. So first of all, let's have a look at a brief introduction of the topic. After the British gained control over the Indian territory, they introduced various acts and regulations. Initially, these acts were introduced to regulate the operations of East India Company in India. Gradually, after the abolition of Company's rule, these acts focused on the administrative functioning and effective working of the British rule. Now let's discuss about constitutional development during Company's rule. First is Regulating Act of 1773. It was the first attempt by British government to administer and regulate the functions of the East India Company. The main reason to introduce this act was Company's bad governance, which resulted into bankruptcy of Bengal. Some of the main provisions of this act were: it designated the Governor of Bengal as the Governor General of Bengal, and the Governor of Bombay and Madras were made subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal. The Regulating Act provided for the establishment of the Supreme Court at Calcutta in 1774. Few defects of this act were: the Governor General had no veto power, the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court was not clearly marked, and the act did not address any problem of people of Bengal. Next is Amending Act of 1781. It was passed to remove the defects of the Regulating Act of 1773. The powers of the Supreme Court in Calcutta were defined, and this act was the first step in India towards separation of the executive from the judiciary. Pitt's India Act 1784. Pitt's India Act was passed in the British Parliament at a time when Company was waging a losing war with the Marathas. The main provisions of this act were: it established the dual system of control by the British government. It led to the establishment of a board of control which consisted of 6 members. The board was empowered to control all civil, military and revenue matters in India. The Governor General's Council was reduced to 3 members. The Governor General was granted veto power, and Bombay and Madras presidencies became subordinate to Bengal presidency. The main defect of this act was that it did not clearly demarcate the jurisdiction of Court of Director and Board of Control. Next is Amending Act of 1786. Lord Cornwallis was appointed as the Governor General of Bengal as well as the Commander-in-Chief. The Governor General got power to override the majority of the Council in special cases relating to peace, defense, etc. Charter Act of 1813. This act was introduced because of the continental system of Napoleon Bonaparte, which affected British trade. The main provisions of this act were: it ended the trade monopoly of the East India Company in India, it granted permission to Christian missionaries to visit India to promote Christianity, and it included provision on investing rupees 1 lakh every year on education. Charter Act of 1833. It was passed by the British Parliament to renew the Charter of the East India Company, which was last renewed in 1813. Some of the main provisions of this act were: the act made Governor General of Bengal the Governor General of India. The company's monopoly over trade with China and in tea also ended, and the member of Governor General's Council was fixed at 4. Charter Act of 1853. Charter Act of 1853 was the last Charter Act passed for the East India Company. Some of the main provisions of this act were: it separated the legislative and executive functions of the Governor General's Council. A separate legislative council was established which was known as the Indian Central Legislative Council. It introduced an open competitive system of selection and recruitment of civil servants. It introduced local representation in the Indian Legislative Council. As out of 6 members, 4 were to be appointed by the local government of Madras, Bombay, Bengal and Agra. Now let's discuss about constitutional development under Crown rule. First is Government of India Act 1858. The revolt of 1857 attracted the attention towards the several shortcomings of the company's rule in India. To overcome those defects, the Government of India Act 1858 was passed. Some of its important provisions were: the Act provided that India was to be governed directly and in the name of the Crown. The designation of Governor General of India was changed to the Viceroy of India. It abolished the dual government introduced by Pitt's India Act. It created a new office, Secretary of State, vested with complete authority and control over Indian administration. It established a 15-member Council of India to assist the Secretary of State for India. Next is Indian Council Act of 1861. This act made a beginning of representative institutions in India by associating Indian with the law-making process. Some of its important provisions are: Viceroy Council's legislative and executive functions were separated as a legislative council was created. It provided that the Viceroy should nominate some Indians as non-official members of his extended legislative council. It empowered Viceroy to issue ordinance in case of emergency. The Act also gave recognition to the portfolio system. Next is Indian Council Act of 1909. The Indian Council Act of 1909 is also commonly known as Morley-Minto Reform. The main features of this act are: it increased the size of the Legislative Council at both central and provincial levels. It enlarged the functions of the Legislative Councils at both levels, such as moving resolutions on the budget. The Act provided for association of Indian with the Executive Council of the Viceroy. It introduced the system of communal representation for Muslims. As per this, the Muslim members were to be elected only by the Muslim voters. The main drawback of this act was the introduction of separate electorate, which further divided the Indian society on the basis of religious identities. Next is Government of India Act of 1919. This act is also known as the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms and was passed by the British Parliament to expand the participation of Indians in the Government of India. The key provisions of this act are: the sphere of the central and provincial governments were demarcated. Thus, the subjects were divided into two, that is, central and provincial. At provincial level, diarchy was introduced, which resulted in division of subjects into two categories, namely reserved and transferred. This act set up a bicameral legislature at the center with two houses, upper house with 60 members and lower house with 145 members. Majority of both houses were chosen by direct election, which were based on limited franchise. It extended the system of communal representation by introducing separate electorates for Sikhs, Indian Christian, Anglo-Indian and Europeans. It separated the union budget from the provincial budget for the first time. The main shortcoming of this act was that the ultimate power remained in the hand of the Viceroy, and the British government followed the policy of carrot and stick to tackle the uproar of Indian nationalists. Government of India Act of 1935. This act introduced various administrative changes, and many provisions were also included in the Constitution of Independent India. The main provisions of this act are: provincial autonomy was introduced in the provinces and diarchy was abolished. The act divided the power between the center and the provinces into three lists, namely federal list, provincial list and concurrent list. It introduced diarchy at the center. Thus, the federal subjects were divided into two categories, reserved and transferred list. The principle of communal representation was extended to depressed classes and women. It also provided for the establishment of institutions like Federal Court and Reserve Bank of India. India Independence Act of 1947. The India Independence Act of 1947 was an act of the British Parliament that partitioned British India into two new independent dominions of India and Pakistan. As per the main provisions of this act, it ended British rule in India and declared India as an independent and sovereign state from August 15, 1947. The boundaries between the two dominion states were to be determined by a boundary commission headed by Sir Ratcliffe. Until the constitution was formulated by the constituent assemblies, it will work in accordance with the Government of India Act 1935. It granted freedom to the Indian princely states either to join India or Pakistan or to remain independent. Now lastly, moving on to the timeline, Acts and Governor General or Viceroys. Regulating Act of 1773, Warren Hastings. Amending Act of 1781, Warren Hastings. Pitt's India Act 1784, Warren Hastings. Amending Act of 1786, Lord Cornwallis. Charter Act of 1813, Lord Minto I. Charter Act of 1833, Lord William Bentinck. Charter Act of 1853, Lord Dalhousie. Government of India Act of 1858, Lord Canning. Indian Council Act of 1861, Lord Canning. Indian Council Act of 1909, Lord Minto II. Government of India Act of 1919, Lord Chelmsford. Government of India Act of 1935, Lord Willingdon. And India Independence Act of 1947, Lord Mountbatten. Now moving on to the practice questions. First of all, note down the prelims question. The Radcliffe Committee was appointed to solve the problems of minorities in India, give effect to Independence Bill, delimit boundaries between India and Pakistan, or to inquire into riots in East Bengal. Now moving on to the mains question. It would have been difficult for the Constituent Assembly to complete its historic task of drafting the Constitution for independent India in just 3 years, but for the experience gained with the Government of India Act 1935. Discuss. So that's all for today. Stay tuned for the next episode. Thanks for watching.